From covering the climate crisis to the freedom of information, from the rise of artificial intelligence to covering wars across Europe and the Middle East, telling the truth has become a danger to the lives of journalists around the world. Hello and welcome to The Big Interview. In this special edition of the program, a panel of professional journalists will dissect the strides made on World Press Freedom Day, but also look at the struggles that journalists continue to endure and still are to overcome. Our panel includes Ira Mathur, who is an award-winning Indian-born professional multimedia journalist. Her memoir, Love the Dark Days, was the winner of the 2023 Bocas Prize for Nonfiction. We have also with us Andy Johnson, who is a veteran journalist and who actually just published his book From Los Bajos to the World. He is a veteran journalist and has covered numerous topics, both across Trinidad and Tobago and across the world. And finally, we have Kaymar Jordan, who is a Barbadian veteran journalist with 30 years experience. She is now the managing editor of the Trinidad and Tobago Guardian newspaper and Guardian Media Limited right here, who is hosting this program. She has also worked for the Barbados Nation newspaper, as well as the Jamaica Gleaner newspaper, as well as Cana News Agency. The theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day is a press for the planet, journalism in the face of the environmental crisis. And that's where we'd like to begin. Ira, thank you very much for being with us and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
In this era of covering climate change, journalists face two very big prospects, having to go up against both governments as well as the oil and gas industry. Covering the climate change crisis and sticking with the theme of this year's event, how challenging is it to be a journalist covering the climate crisis?
Well, you know, I'd like to start off by saying that the Media Association of Trinidad and Tobago has sent out a release, and especially honoring Palestinian journalists this year, because 10% of journalists were killed in the war in Gaza. And that's over, you know, that's like over 100 journalists have been killed, and they are being honored by the international, by various international bodies. So today I'd really like to pay tribute to them. Regarding the crisis, the environmental crisis, it's so interesting that, you know, the number of environmental journalists being attacked or killed is rising, and it really does continue to be one of the most dangerous fields of journalism after war reporting. And I'm assuming that part of the reason is that there is always that fight between the environment and corporate entities, and therefore it is a risk to be environmental journalists, because you're asking corporations not to go at the environment at the rate and without the way that they should actually operate within reason. They have not been operating like that. So yeah, yes, it is a big issue.
Andy, have you been surprised by the level of lobbying and the level of challenges that journalists covering the environment face in this era?
Well, before we get there, Ryan, I just want to say that I feel like a thorn between two roses, happily so, with these ladies on my side here. You know, we've all worked together at some point.
Ladies, Andy has always been good with words. He's always been excellent with words.
We love him. We do love him. Yeah. We worked here at the same time, so it's a pleasure.
Yeah, but this is just the issue of the moment and of the age, as you might say. It's the environment now. You know, in previous decades, it was something else. It was the North-South debate, development versus underdevelopment. You know, it was in a case where you had what now is referred to as progressiveness, so that some governments come up with sort of different plans for their people, and that runs head-on into people's feelings and as to how they want to be governed and brought up. And there's always been a tension. And I come from a tradition in which there's a man named Owen Batiste, God bless his soul. He used to say, well, you have to be prepared to deal with the tension, because it's not a cakewalk for in a lot of respects. So whatever the issue is at any point in time, in any country that purports to want to be allowing for a free press, there are always, you know, points at which we collide.
Kaymar, you have, in your time here at Guardian Media, you've made it a priority, environmental journalism. You've supported a number of your journalists to pursue climate stories and environmental stories. This theme must mean something to you.
It definitely does, Ryan. And I want to touch on to what Andy said because, you know, depending on where you are in the globe, it makes whatever the issue is more poignant. We don't have a lot of specialist reporters in the Caribbean, and particularly here in Trinidad and Tobago. But I've had the pleasure of seeing persons like yourself and Colleen who's saying take on environment as a major area. And we've had to support that. Why? Because at the core of us, in countries like Trinidad and Tobago that experience significant flooding annually, people lose livelihoods as a result of it. The environment becomes more focused. Now, we don't feel the threat of the journalists in terms of that you're going to die here because you're covering that issue, but we can't gloss over it still in terms of that overall, there are other issues that put journalists up against the authorities in a way that put not only them, but the profession in serious danger. Right?
With 3 decades of experience in this industry, having traveled around the Caribbean as well, I just wonder, coming to Trinidad and Tobago and working at Guardian Media, what have you made of press freedom in this country?
I think we in the Caribbean are more alike than we think. People say, well, you know, you're moving from... I lived in Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago in the region, and people would say to you, okay, what's different? From a press freedom standpoint, really and truly, we are very alike. There is always this constant, the media up against the authorities, people, and the problem we have in the Caribbean is that this is not the United States of America. The UK is another place I lived, but the reality is you can't go as far as a journalist in the UK in terms of your reportage, and you have to be careful. It has made us a lot more fearful. We've had newsrooms where people say, boss, I'm not touching that. We see that here in Trinidad just as powerfully as you see it in Jamaica. And there are circumstances where, especially with crime reporting, that we are particularly concerned about where we send our journalists, and it calls for level then and amounts to a level of self-censorship at the end of the day. So the issues are very much alike, Ryan, in terms of Press Freedom Day. Are we free? No. Are we in shackles? No. There is a kind of a middle way. We have more freedom on some issues, but other issues, we're facing a lot of pushback.
I know that journalists on this day tend to focus particularly on politicians and those in authority, but civil society also pressures journalists. Andy and Kaymar, both their names are in Calypso songs, not for the right reasons. When it comes to civil society and the support from civil society, Andy, that remains also a challenge to also conquer.
Well, it is because so civil society organizations are simply, in my estimation at least, another kind of pressure group that you have to deal with, and sometimes a lot of professional people go in there because they don't want to be associated with a government or with an opposition, but they choose a cause in the society that they are for, and in some instances, they treat journalists the same way that other people in power and authority do. If you don't get their side of the story in which they want, they come hard at you. And there are people who I think I wish more of us as media people could sometimes get the kind of training and orientation that people get when when they're preparing to take some of these civil society jobs, but because they're very prepared. And they know what they want to deal with, how they want to be seen, how they want to be presented, and sometimes that causes clashes between us and them as a different kind of pressure group in the society.
I do want to come back to a point that Kaymar made, that the press neither is free nor are they in shackles. Ira, if we had to talk about legislative framework to ensure press freedom and to advance press freedom, what would you say is the most required when it comes to that topic?
I think that, first of all, we have to understand that Trinidad and Tobago actually ranks very high by Reporters Without Borders. In fact, we are one of the highest in terms of press freedoms in the Caribbean. Of course, there are various levels of legislation which are concerning, and Matt has always kept a very keen lookout on them. I think it's always surprised me, and it came to me especially during the pandemic, exactly how fearless our journalists are. They were quite fearless. They were on the front lines. And as we banded together as a group, we found that it was really quite easy to hold the powerful to account, because during the pandemic, it was an ideal time for people in authority to push back against the media and to have their own narrative be told. And so that was a time when a joint media. We came together in our numbers, and we actually held the government to account. So I would say Trinidad and Tobago is extremely healthy, and I think that's amazing given all the setbacks that our journalists face on a daily basis.
I'm going to throw that question as you. Yeah, please, Andy.
I'm going to add to that. There was a period in the period when the party led by the late great Basdeo Pandey was Prime Minister. There was a massive demonstration through the streets of Port of Spain advertising the fact that as people in the media, and it was organized by media workers, not by media managers and so on, you know, insisting that this is a country in which freedom of the press, you know, is sacred to us and to the people for whom we work. And we walked up and down the streets here talking about we will stand in the face of any attempts to erode whatever is there about the freedom of the press in Trinidad.
Can I just add that Andy was very much part of the starting up the Media Association over 33 years ago in the Express building. And you spoke about legislation, and I want to say that Matt has been aware of legislation, including the Cybercrime Bill 2017, the Data Protection Act 2011, the Broadcast Code, and the Sexual Offences Amendment 3 Bill 2021. We are very aware that this could have a chilling effect on press freedom, and we've kept a very key eye on it.
Up next.
So there will always be threats. That's not going to go away. But we also, too, have to be fair, F-A-I-R, and fearless in terms of how we pursue our profession.
What would be your suggestions if you had to suggest to those in authority to ensure that press freedom is protected? What would be your advice to them?
Well, I think that because we claim to be a democracy, we know that the media is part of the fourth estate. It's a very powerful pillar of democracy. In fact, we hold all the other institutions to account. And what I would say to people in power, that it may suit you over a very short term to muzzle journalists, but it won't suit you when you're on the other side. And a free and fair press ensures that we remain a strong democracy. And of course, with a strong democracy, you get strong alliances globally and you get a strong economy. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Kaymar, beyond the politicians that we could speak about, press freedom also comes under threat from the rise of social media and artificial intelligence in differing ways, but it's certainly still a threat.
Certainly, and I mean, again, to tack on to what my colleagues have been saying so far, you know, we talk a lot about the politicians and what they're doing. We haven't touched on self-censorship. There is, as well, within media organizations, our own, you know, built-in block sometimes to stop us from touching this topic A, topic B. Sometimes, you know, I always tell people, it is always good to talk about the truth, but what I've found in our society is when that truth hits home, and it doesn't matter if you're a politician, if you're a journalist, when it hits to your back door, it's a completely different thing. So that's important. But you touch social media is an extension of that. And it is it's a threat, but it's also an opportunity, because what we found here at Guardian Media and in media generally across the Caribbean is that even though we've seen the explosion of social media, traditional media has still had a place, because when there's need for verification of that information, where people come to, let me see what Rambeshu is saying on the 7 o'clock news. Let me see what's happening on Guardian Media's platform. Let me look at the reputable news agencies for verification of that. So there has been this explosion. It offers threats to us because it's fake news. But the truth is, at the end of the day, when people are seeking to get to the bottom of the issue, it is really with the traditional that they still return to. And that's why we still have power and we still have
precisely because the thing is that what has come to be regarded as another form of media. In a lot of cases, social media is opinion sharing. A lot of people have perspectives on things, opinions about things, and they put it out there, and it gets around the world and comes back before you know sometimes. But reporters have to take great care.
Correct.
You know, and attention to what we take in and what we put out to people. And a lot of people just make not enough of the importance of that. You know, and in trying to just clear my head for this discussion last night, I just looked up what is put out there, some of what is put out there as to what is meant the importance of a free press. And it says in one case here, it is the media's role in advancing peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. The media has a role to play in promoting and supporting good governance. It is an agency which is duty-bound to help promote dialogue, mutual understanding, and reconciliation among peoples. And sometimes the extent to which we go to great lengths to do that, there are always people whose interest it is not to get information out that is required to be out for people to make informed decisions and so on, because given sometimes people's perspectives or where they sit, whether in business, whether in government or wherever, there are things that they would prefer not to be known in the way that we want to bring it out. And those things create tensions among this estate and others.
Yeah, and Ryan, the two things that you would know that I always say to the media, my journalists, one is, it is not what you think you know, it is what you can prove. And this is part of the challenge for us as we talk about press freedom, because if we go out there and we follow the whistleblowers and we just run everything they say, at the end of the day, if we can't prove that, we're going to face the lawsuits, we're going to face the issues. So that is one of the ways that we're kept in check currently because of the system. So if there's going to be a closer move to what we see in the developed societies in terms of more press freedom, in terms of not only the legislation, but the entire psyche in terms of how we approach that. The other thing, to tie on to what Andy's saying, that I always say to my journalists is, it's most important to be first and right. So people will say sometimes, well, we haven't seen Guardian Media post these stories yet. And it's important for the public to understand the reason you haven't seen that is because behind the scenes, we have to do the verification. We can't follow the influencers and just put it on our site. Exactly. Because if it is not right, we're going to face a bigger repercussion. So to whom much is given in terms of press freedom, much is expected.
Much is expected.
And much work needs to be done.
Yeah, there's another point I show, right?
Sorry,
that there are times when I've had somebody comes to you with what to them is a scoop, and they give you a line on something and so on, and they would say to you, well, don't go and talk to so and so, because he could tell you something else. And I'm saying, but I have to speak to the people whose interest it is to hear what is being said to get it balanced. And there are some people whose misunderstanding about what we do is that, so they tell you something and they want to see it on the air or broadcast, but you can't get a balancing view on that, because that will sort of at least diminish the strength of what they're saying, and that's something you have to deal with.
I think part of the issue is that people don't understand that the role of the media is to hold the powerful to account. And ironically, it's the powerful in any society that has the biggest voices, that has the money, and that maybe even run the media organizations. And we ultimately are also a voice for the voiceless. So how do you balance that in an age where, a media boss can come to you and say, listen, I have to run a newsroom. I need this ad. If you run this story, this ad will be pulled. And I've actually seen it. I think we've seen it especially during elections, right? Mm-hmm. Because certain parties come and say, we don't like that story, pull it. So that is where journalists are sometimes squeezed. And I think in that context, in a country where, frankly, journalists are not very well paid, I'm not sure that their hours are great. From the research that I've done, journalists tend to be extreme. They have mental health issues and they have a lot of physical health issues. And several of the older journalists that I've known actually died while they were ill and overworked. So given all of that, I think that our journalists in this country have really proven over and over again that it's a vocation, and they literally do not care that much about even being sacked, because they are out to get the story and they're out to get it right.
How do we protect them from that then? Getting sacked. You just mentioned an incredible example, especially during election times. If the company itself isn't doing well, the best source of funding would be from political parties, but those same political parties you're covering night in, night out.
Yeah. Well, I think the best way to do that is to have a very, very strong media association. That is where, yes, we are, we're colleagues and we compete, but at the end of the day, we're a body of journalists who have to support that whole idea, that pillar. So that kind of came up a few times during the pandemic where, you know, journalists were kept out of Parliament. Some of them were kept out of various swearing-ins. And at that time, it was amazing the way, like the Express, the Guardian, the Newsday, we all came together and we said, no, we don't want the government photographer. We are sending one of our own. We're going to pool this. And you see, I don't think the media here understand how powerful the voice of something like Matt is. Because if Matt speaks out and says, you know, we are being repressed, we are being bullied, then we also have affiliates throughout the Caribbean and throughout the world. That's why Press Freedom Day is so important, because we are actually linking hands globally with fellow journalists all around the world.
We are running out of time, but I do want to spend a few minutes talking about the global landscape of journalism, and I do have three very senior people with me this afternoon. When you look at the global landscape of journalism and where we're at right now, Andy, are you satisfied where journalism is headed, especially particularly to press freedom?
Well, when you say where it's headed, what do you mean? Because
the state of where we are at right now, yeah. And you know, when we look at the rise of right-wing groups and nationalism across the world seeking to suppress, you know, climate change, different wars.
Well, I think it's the issue of the day, where that is simply the current situation relating to current issues, but it has gone on. Whether it was, you know, in the wars in 1967, Israel, Egypt, different parts of what was happening in Europe.
It's just a different era, same thing.
Yeah, same thing. And media people just have to keep your integrity intact as you perform. And sometimes, as both Kaymar and you were saying, in some cases, it is the people to whom we report who make deals for one reason or the other, and that tends sometimes to color what we do, because we have to be careful, because somebody is in a position where they can pull a multi-$1,000 ad from a campaign from the paper or from on the air and so on. So sometimes it requires people to walk on eggshells, you know, whether in the management suites or on the ground, as we try to do the work that we have to do. But it's a tension, it's a push and pull that I have not had anything but joy going after. I could tell you what my stories about being found in Grenada when the authorities thought that there was a clean slate when they displaced Maurice Bishop and what was going to happen, and being under interrogation for hours before I was expelled, and what happened, who I spoke with, who told me a couple of months before that what they had told me was not the truth, but this is now the truth. That kind of as to what was happening there, and that's just one example, you know.
I think ultimately the profession has to be a profession, and we have to have basic standards for ourselves as journalists. Yes, there's going to be that push and pull in terms of, we always know, for instance, newspapers, advertising pays for newspapers to be published. But I think what we are seeing in the Caribbean, and by extension in the world, is that media people have to stand for something ultimately, not just for the environmental causes, but ultimately, what is the breaking point for me in terms of my relationship with any particular media house, if it is that we're feeling so compromised. So I think that's an important thing for the individual practitioners on a day like today. But I'll say my own experience has been that there is also a healthy respect from media bosses and owners for what goes on within the newsrooms across Trinidad and Tobago and across the region. And the leadership and the staffers themselves, just as we lobbied during COVID, we have to have a view of what it is that we're going to be standing for. And I think a strong newsroom that is in defense of press freedom ultimately redounds to a strong business, because that's why people trust us. They expect that when they see Ryan Baisha at 7 o'clock, he's telling me facts only. Yeah? They expect, and I've had this before, I've had situations where I've come up against a particular person of influence, and I see people on the social media saying, we believe Kaymar Jordan. And that's the best kind of support that you need, that needs to gird your loins as a journalist and build your soul in terms of what it is that we're involved in here. So there will always be threats. That's not going to go away. But we also, too, have to be fair, F-A-I-R, and fearless in terms of how we pursue our profession.
Let me just tell you something about this situation, about the role we play, the function we perform, and where we sit in society. Over my 50 years in the business, between 1973 and now, I don't have enough fingers and toes on my body to tell you the people who began as journalists and ended up as corporate communications, somebody in the private sector or in a government one way or the other, you know, or in other spheres in the society, because of how they were regarded by people who paid attention to their work. And sometimes the best of us get in a situation where sometimes you get an offer that you can't refuse, because as Ira was saying, sometimes the pay could be the pay and compensation could be much better than it is, but it is what it is, and so if you get a fine offer.
Don't forget the hours. The hours are much better.
Yeah.
Can I just very quickly say one last thing? That last year, it was the most dangerous to be a reporter since 2015. So without the courage of correspondents, literally risking everything to report from conflict areas, we are under the risk of zones of silence, not just in war, but like you said, in the environment. And that is what we all have to really fight against.
Ira Mathur, Andy Johnson, Kaymar Jordan, thank you very much for being on the Big Interview program with us. And thank you very much for tuning in to the Big Interview on a Sunday evening. We appreciate your time. And remember, it takes a journalist.